from the different delegation side. There's a Russian delegation, so he will be spending a very little time with us. But it's a great pleasure that he's come across and he's joined us. He's the Minister for Commerce and Industry and Civil Aviation, and he's got his pulse on the infrastructure sector. Special welcome also to our guest of honor, Shri Amitabh Kant ji, who's been a very strong supporter for us with different mandates that we've been doing with Niti Aayog. So it's a really pleasure to really welcome them across. And the other dignitary on the dais is Ashu Suyash, our MD and CEO Crisil. So I think we will just quickly go through with this thing. I welcome all of you all to this conference. We started this last year, the Conclave. And this was more the whole germination of the idea really came in from the fact that we have tomes and tomes of knowledge. Me and my team at Crisil Infrastructure Advisory have tomes and tomes of knowledge, domain expertise around the infrastructure sector. And we wanted to bring this across and get a sort of a platform where the senior stakeholders can actually come together and debate a very vibrant sector. Right now, not much has been happening in the sector, but I think this is very critical and imperative. Last year's conference actually talked about how do we really get innovative financing mechanisms to kickstart or take the infrastructure sector financing forward. This year, the theme that we are looking at is how do we enable private sector participation. So I think the theme this year is a very imperative one. Private sector has actually dwindled quite a bit participation in the infrastructure investments. And right now we are hoping that we will be today, through our deliberations, we'll be able to get across some good solutions, how to enable private sector revival in the infrastructure investments. So I think that's the key theme. Crisil has done a lot of work and we will be sharing our insights through the different sessions. Very quickly, the structure that we have is we will have this inaugural session where yearbook and Crisil Infra Invex will be launched. And then we'll follow it up with a theme session just after a coffee break. And then in the afternoon, we have 3 concurrent breakout sessions. One on transport, one on power distribution, and the third one is on urban water supply. So we are looking at privatization and PPP flows in each of these sectors. So I think without further ado, we are changing the program a little bit given the time constraint that we have. So I would just request Shri Suresh Prabhuji and Amitabh Kant to first unveil the yearbook, and then we will have a keynote address from him. So if you can just have this, I think we'll all go across to the podium there. There's a button we'll press, and I think there will be launch of the yearbook.
Thank you very much, dear sirs.
So just before I hand over to Mr. Suresh Prabhu, keynote speaker, just want to talk about a minute on the yearbook. The yearbook is a compilation of all that has happened in the infrastructure sector over the last 1 year, and that's what you'll be having a chance to really look at it after this session. Yeah. So I'll just invite the minister to give his keynote address. Thank you.
Good morning, friends. I want to attend a delegation little talk with the Prime Minister and President Putin is going to do. That's why I was saying I cannot go late there. And that's one reason I want to go early. And the second reason is when we have got such a distinguished colleague of mine, Mr. Amitabh Kant, who is going to speak, so I will not be able to speak better than him. We have always been grappling with the issue, what can put India on a fast track of growth? And there is almost a unanimous agreement that one of the biggest impediments for growth is infrastructure. The other element of that is when you create infrastructure, in the process of creating itself, you cause growth. The investment that goes into infrastructure will be the trigger for growth. And of course, when the infrastructure is created, it becomes a platform for growth. And therefore, infrastructure has always been identified as one of the big challenges. And the amount of money that is needed to be invested into infrastructure, China did more than 12% of the GDP year after year, and we are trying to do at least 10% of the GDP, would mean that we need to put in $250 or $260 billion today, if it is 10%. And when we reach $5 trillion economy, it should reach $500 billion. When we reach $10 trillion, $1 trillion. So that kind of investment is necessary for investment into infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is necessary, investment is necessary. The question is who should fund it? Whether it should come only from the government, because largely all over the world, public infrastructure has been created with public money. This is one of the first of its kind, including China, which created huge infrastructure, almost all with public money. Including the great infrastructure, we talk about Europe, US, most of it got created by using public money. So if we want to now need that kind of investment, and that investment, obviously the government has only one way of funding it, by taxing more and then fund it, even if you can say any other form, but finally it boils down to that. And therefore, we need to get private sector, which is the part of your today's program. Private sector investment is possible, and I'll give only two examples how it is possible. When I was the Minister of Railways, so first let me tell you about Minister of Power. And he's my colleague who was there with me in power sector. People told me that power sector is doomed, nothing can happen, and they used to give me very reasons. So because like your advisory, there are so many advisors in the country. So they'll come and tell me why it cannot happen. I said, boss, I need not why it cannot happen, how it can happen. Because nobody need to tell me why it cannot happen, then there is no need to talk to you also. If nothing can happen, then why should I talk to you? And then we decided that we change a policy. Only one law we bought it, Electricity Act. Pre-Electricity Act, our capacity was less than 100,000 megawatts. Within less than a decade, a little more than a decade, because it takes time to build new plant itself, 6-7 years. We got a capacity which is almost 3.5 times of what we had pre-Electricity Act. Most of it, more than 60%, almost 2/3, came from private sector. Before the law, in installed capacity of less than 100,000, less than 2% was from private sector. So what does it mean? That if you create a policy framework, you can get investment. But it is also partly true that only policy can help you. If you make policy, it should be consistent, it should be transparent, it should be reliable, and it should also be dynamic. Because you cannot say, I have taken policy once, and I have taken holiday, and I am going to come back after several decades. That's what we did in our past policies for many decades. So it has to be dynamic, and constantly you must upgrade it and try to find out about it. One of the key reasons where despite adding huge capacity in power sector, which came largely from private sector, and that is about few $100 billion has come into power sector, thanks to that. But that again created a problem because we created capacity at generation and had a bottleneck and distribution. And that issue also was foreseen by us. And therefore, at the same time, we had come out with a distribution reform, first time in India, in 2001, first time. Provided 40,000 crores. Now, that time dollar, if you take, it was something like $80-90 billion. And that money was to be given to the states for working on distribution. I don't want to get into how this was, but this we are well thought out strategy. At the first time, the federal government was willing to give money for distribution reform, which is more or less 99%, if not 100, because some union territories, central government will have a role. It was with private sector, with the state government. And therefore, despite the state government, its responsibility, we decided to give it to them. Unfortunately, subsequently, when we lost power, we spent the money, but did not get the result. Because we felt that spending money was the only purpose of getting this. Now, if we had done that, power sector today would have been cash surplus, would have been able to address this because distribution is a very key component. That's the end at which you collect all the money. And that to not only collect the money, value addition of generation, transmission, sub-transmission has happened already. So 85-87% of value addition has already gone in and then you don't recover the money. So not only lose, but lose value added money. Second example is railways. When I was railways minister, I prepared a plan for $144 billion. Everybody was telling me railway needs money. At the same time, the person who was telling me this would also add immediately, but we had no money. So I said, very good idea, so why do you need again the advisor? So I think I'm sure Crisil advisory is different. They will tell me why it cannot happen. I said, very good. If you are telling me why it cannot happen, then might as well close down and go home and relax. We prepared a plan for $144 billion, 8,50,000 crores in my first budget. And we found money of 40,000 crores from LIC within less than a week. And that is a win-win situation. LIC keeps getting money and they need annuity. Railways has assets far more than one can imagine. The value of assets of railways will be more than the India GDP, really speaking, because of land. And we have tangible assets. Cash flows, $35 billion of cash flow annually. So this was something which will always make sure. So we created a policy. We got even private sector participation. So infrastructure creation is something which can happen provided you have a policy, consistent policy, transparent policy, dynamic policy. And that too end-to-end solutions. You cannot just tinker with one part of it and leave rest of it. In fact, the PTC, which we actually created, in fact, I was the one who operationalized it. And that time again we are thinking that wherever we have these systemic issues, some little pockets in which we have shortages and nationally we have problem, we do that. In fact, that time only we planned a national grid, which is now under implementation. So point I am saying is end-to-end solutions are necessary for everything. Other challenges in infrastructure is there are many agencies involved. Most of projects have to come on land, not most, all infrastructure. I always keep jocularly saying that airports cannot be built in air, nor the seaports can be built in sea. So we need land for everything. And land is with the states. So how do you deal with that? And therefore, we need to find out a solution. Some states have done some very innovative work, including Andhra Pradesh, wherein the stakeholders, there is nothing like, we always come out with the concept land losers. So first you start about a concept that you are loser. How is going to be participating into this? So first you should change the nomenclature. You should not see the land loser. So land loser means he's gone. Now he's gone because he's a loser. We can say the land winner because by selling land he has won something. So anyway, some states have come out with innovative solutions. So that is one of the key issues. Policy, land, the real issue. Then finance. And there I think there is a tremendous scope. If we work out with the proper structures. When I was my Prime Minister Sherpa for G20, I had proposed to the G20 maybe 3-4 years ago 4 years ago, that G20 at that time, post 2008, had a unique problem. G20, any case, has about 80-85% of the global GDP. The problem was there were surpluses within the system and there is no deployment possible. So I said, why not we make sure that your surpluses and our requirement can be matched, provided we come out with the right instruments and some sort of proper structuring. So what is necessary? Money is available. So it is not true that money is not available, but proper structuring as well as proper instruments. Instruments are also very important. What kind of paper we will issue is very important. And therefore, we must work out a proper structure for financing. And one of the problems in India is most of the money is basically comes from where? It's all household savings. Household savings, most of it goes into the banking system. Of course, China has another issue. China has 50% of the saving rate, and all of the money was going to the banking system at 2% or so, because that's what the regulated rate. So Chinese had a great advantage of drawing on a huge pool of resources at the cheapest cost, and they could deploy it. In India, when it goes to banking system, the banking system is the time and demand liabilities are less than 5 years. Whereas in infrastructure, you need to invest for nothing can happen in 5 years. We not even build up a plant in 5 years. So it's all pre-operation expenses, actually. So how can you actually service a loan when you have an investment that has gone in, which is not even started generating cash flows? So we therefore need to find out instruments which will fund infrastructure on a long-term basis. And that's why I gave example of LIC, because LIC, more or less the funds are for 30-40 years, because when you take a policy, you will take a policy for 30-40 years, so you keep getting money, and that has to be deployed for a long-term basis. I have talked to the super funds of Australia. I had a detailed meeting with them. I invited them, they come here. I was in Australia, they've talked to them. So we are trying to work with them. With Canada, we are trying to work with them. Uniqueness of this is both Canada and Australia, their total pension funds are more than their national GDP. So obviously by definition you have to invest it outside. But that doesn't mean money is available, that's why it's going to come tomorrow. We have to work out instruments, properly structures, which will ensure them. We are working with them, we are talking to them. Also, on the 15th of this month, I invited the chairman of Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. Probably, they don't disclose, but probably $1.6 trillion. That's a huge size. And therefore, this fund can also make investments into India. They are very keen because they feel India is a growth story. India's GDP is bound to rise. India has all the fundamentals in place. We have a right leader in Prime Minister Modi, who is focusing on infrastructure in a very aggressive way. So they want to invest in India. But now, with all the things in place, where is it missing? Is areas of instruments, structures, policies, stability, and all of that put together. So I think we have to work out sector by sector, find out where we need to put proper policy intervention, where we need to find out the kind of instruments we need, and I think we can work out on a structured way like this. I think we'll be able to address the issue in a very significant. Of course, the major issue that comes in is the user charges, because our mindset has to change, because we feel our inherent right is to have infrastructure. It's my fundamental right, but even more fundamental than fundamental right is not to pay for it. Then it is never going to work. Unless we can work out a system whereby it can pay. And this has successfully, where it has been succeeded, in case of telephones. Telecom, people are willing to pay the price. I was all the time saying that even in power this will happen. South Africa, one of the countries just after they became free from apartheid, they actually started electrifying because most of the areas were not electrified. And they came out with a very interesting system, that prepaid meter. You buy meter first and then I will provide you electricity. So people are willing to pay, provided we work out a proper system even for that. So payment is very important. If nothing is possible, if it is not bankable. So bankability of a project will become only when we have how do you get cash flows into the system. And to do that, it is always possible. And therefore, I was talking about distribution reforms for power sector, wherein bankability would have been ensured by distribution reforms. And that would have changed the entire dynamics of power sector, and we could have worked on that. But I think I'm sure we are on the right track in many areas. We are very sure that infrastructure will cause growth while we create it. And as I said, it will be a platform for future growth once we actually finish doing it. So I really wish you all the best. Crisil is the right agency to do that. And I'm sure with the dynamic leadership of Crisil, he's going to do that. And I think Crisil has decided that if you want the Crisil to be very reliable, dependable, then women should head it. So therefore, I'm very happy that we are trying to work on it, and we'll make sure that the agency will be able to provide the necessary support and advice to us. I really look forward to that happening. All the best to you. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry for the little bit of a chaos. Given the time constraints, I think we are juggling around the schedule a little bit. I would now actually call upon Ashu to really set the context and share some of her perspectives on privatization. As I said, the theme is enabling private sector participation and PPPs. And I think this is a very important imperative according to me, and I think the minister also alluded to that. And I think let's have this presentation from Ashu, and they'll throw a little bit more light on that. Ashu.
Very warm welcome and good morning to all of you. It's a real privilege to be with such an august audience, and especially the privilege of having Shri Suresh Prabhuji today, despite his schedule, and Shri Amitabh Kant ji as well. In some ways, what better audience than all of you and stakeholders as both of them to deliberate, discuss and debate on the topic of infrastructure, which is the bedrock of development, not just in India, but in any nation. And it is amply clear, and the minister just mentioned as well, that without infrastructure, you're not really going to see any growth. In fact, that's the backdrop for Crisil to take up this agenda and to really create a forum such as this conclave to deliberate all the issues. You know, it's amply clear that you either completely use public money to put up public infrastructure, or you get private capital to step in. I would like to start by saying that over the last decade, private sector has played a material role and had a big impact on infrastructure investments. In fact, nearly 20 lakh crore, or a third of the total, came from private capital in the past. In fact, across a range of sectors, we saw this investment. National highways and power generation saw massive scale up. I think renewables in particular was something that did very well. And if I think about it and I just look at very near-term numbers, in 2018 alone, nearly 18 gigawatt, got put up in renewables. And it was favorable policies and favorable market conditions that made this happen. Even in airport and on ports itself, a large part from a traffic management perspective is with the private sector. And therefore, not too long ago, India was hailed as the #1 in PPP from an investment activity perspective. And this is between 2008 and 2012. However, the momentum on PPP has seen a sharp slowdown. And I'd simply say this is largely because a lot of the risks that were tabled earlier seem to have played out. The share of private investments from 2008 to 2012 was as much as 37%. And 13 to 17, we saw this come down to 31%. And our estimates are actually, if you look at fiscal 18 numbers, they're probably going to touch 25%. Clearly, this is not good news. And I'd say a lot of it is because of stalled projects, rise in debt, huge stress in the thermal power sector, challenges of fuel availability. The minister also mentioned on the challenges on the distribution side. We've seen the whole DISCOM finances situation play out, land acquisition clearances. I'd also say exuberant traffic projections have created huge challenges, particularly in the BOT toll highway projects. And while we see revival in highways with mechanisms such as the hybrid annuity model and TOT, I think the stress in the other sectors remain. And I think today's forum is where we should spend some time thinking about this and arriving at how we might solve the situation. And therefore, despite strong government spending, the share of infra in the GDP has fallen quite a bit. If I look at the time 2003 to 2007, it was the investment share was about 7% of GDP. It's come down, we think, to the 5.3, 5.5 mark. Our view is to really realize the India growth story, to realize what I would say the India dream. We really need to see investment as a percent of GDP to be in the 6.5% range. Without that, I don't think this India dream is going to be realized. And if I look at why do we see the drop, it is around private investments having remained lukewarm. It is on account of weak demand, capacity underutilization, the fact that the banks have, especially the public sector banks, have been coping with the NPA problem. You're not seeing the flow of ability to get debt capital. The government has really played a very big role because they've stepped up and stepped in, and that is the reason you actually have seen a lot of movement. But I would point out that with the focus of bringing down fiscal deficit, and if you look at numbers, while the share of the center has certainly come down, from a combined fiscal deficit perspective, center and state, you've not really seen a material move. And therefore, I would say that some of these fiscal constraints will definitely come in the way of continued funding from the government. Therefore, we really, the key need of the hour is to get in private capital. While we do see some action on the private sector side, it is concentrated in a few sectors. And sometimes we talk about all gloom and doom. It's not all gloom and doom, because if I think of highways, there is success there. I think the NHAI has seen some record growth in terms of project length awards in 2018. But I would simply say there's a lot more to solve for, and that's something we should focus. I think railways, power distribution, urban infrastructure is yet to see any meaningful impact. So what can we do to really get private infrastructure investment going? I'd say that there are three key vectors. Number one, On the PPP side, we've seen huge progress. But end of the day, the need of the hour is a wider array of PPP models and something that is not a one-size-fits-all. You really must create mechanisms that go beyond the conventional approach. I think BOT alone is not going to do the trick. It's very important to see how asset monetization can be replicated across other sectors, including power transmission, where good assets are available with stable revenue streams. Similarly, in areas like urban water supply with viability challenges, investment-light models like management contracts can help bring in efficiency, if not scale. A rewiring of contracting is essential. And that's where the whole risk allocation is needed. You need flexibility to handle changes and metrics to measure. Because if you stop measuring, I think it's a huge challenge. It's very important to nurture empowered counterparties. It's about creditworthiness and creating those public institutions and allow them to really go out there and play the role that they are meant for. I think I would somewhere be failing if I don't mention the need to strengthen municipal bodies, because end of the day, they are a material institution, especially if we talk about creating the infrastructure that will make a difference to lives. You know, we need financial strengthening and managerial capability building out there. I think a big requirement is interventions to deepen the financial sector. The minister mentioned it. I don't think having institutions without a deep financial sector will really work. End of the day, if I look at what it takes, right? Historically, you had banks funding and project finance institutions. And with the emergence of the universal banking model, you hardly have project finance institutions anymore. And you do have the whole ALM mismatch, as even the minister mentioned. So the need of the hour is to create institutions, leverage institutions that exist, whether it's the insurance sector, the pension sector, to make sure that we tap our domestic bond markets, create that depth, breadth, invite foreign capital as well. And in all of this, strengthening market infrastructure is very important. You know, today, the big debate out there with the IL&FS sharp downgrade, I think, you know, we have to kind of step beyond the issue. And I'm able to talk about it because Crisil has the distinction of not having rated IL&FS, not just 1 or 2 years, but for 20 years. And a point of note is market infrastructure includes rating agencies and credit quality, ratings quality, and that whole awareness and education to ensure how you distinguish quality is of material importance. And the reason I say that is end of the day to attract capital and to allow our institutions to invest appropriately, all the mechanisms is very important. And no question, creating that capacity, building that capacity across frameworks, which is what we're going to discuss, across instruments, across institutions is very important. So on that note, I would like to say, you know, end of the day, we are really positive. This is not about gloom and doom, but it is about caution in the same breath. So I thank you very much for taking the time to be here, patience to listen, and also I think now it's most important to hear from you, Shri Amitabh Kant, because you have far more experience and far more visibility into all of this. So thank you once again, and I'd like to now call on Vivek, literally to take 2 or 3 minutes and then to hand over to Shri Amitabh Kant. Thank you very much.
Very good morning to everybody. Considering the time constraint, I will just quickly go through the key highlights of our Crisil Infra Index. Last year, people who have not attended, just for a quick recap, basically this index looks at attractiveness, private sector attractiveness for each of the sectors. Primarily looks at 4 key pillars. One is on the policy consistency, which Minister also mentioned, what kind of policy consistency we have, whether it is completely rounded, that's one part of it. Second is your regulatory institutional capacity, which is very critical for infrastructure sector, whether we have an independent regulator, how independent they are is the second point. Third is the key for any private sector investment is financial sustainability, which includes the cost recovery as well as potential demand risk, which, for example, just mentioned about the highway traffic, how we did, what kind of demand risk is there. The fourth, last but not the least, is the implementation track record, which is on ground, what kind of constraint, including the external constraint like land acquisition mentioned by the minister also. We have tried to, all these 4 evaluation criteria, we'll try to put that into drags and drivers by putting some quantitative as well as qualitative elements and see how these scores behave for each of the sectors. So first, the key thing for 2018, the power transmission, highway and renewables are top of the chart, which means they are in the stable category. You can see this 4 different quadrants. So you will see in a stable category, power transmission, renewable, which is a shining sector. And of course, they would be because we have seen around 11 gigawatt of installed capacity live last year. Highways were close to 7,400 kilometers. Record PPP was done last year. So they are on the stable side. Whereas there are certain sectors like, which I will say drags remains on the urban, which is the least attractive, conventional energy, where a lot of stress is there, and then power distribution, which remains the critical in the value chain of the entire power sector. But what is more important is also to look at how it behaved vis-a-vis last year, because last year when we presented, we did have a score which was slightly different. So what we will see, the key message here is that there is a quantum jump in highway, whereas transmission and renewable, even though they were toppers last year, there's some degree of decline. I'll come to that for what reasons. And some of the sectors, which other sectors I will say more or less remain stable or in the same range, except airports where they slightly notch above. So I'll just give an example, for example, why we are saying in the power transmission. I think Ashu also mentioned the reason this is one sector which has a very risk-free contracts and a sort of an annuity kind of a business. However, if you see over the period of last year especially, the number of bids for private sector has come down, rather it has been very limited. So this is a sector which can potentially open up for the private sector and clearly fetch money not only for the existing assets but also for the new assets. And there is a private capital lined up to get into this. That's one. Therefore, we put slightly down, and I will see how next year the bids come. On the highway, I think I need not mention it again, but we have seen some success stories, especially on the TOT side of it, and we do some improvement going forward happen, and we see a clear pipeline which we think will happen for the following year also. So that's on the highway side, there is an improvement. On the renewable side, this is a shining sector. I have no doubt that this will play out, and next year also it will be one of the investment zone. However, what we have seen, especially in last year, there have been awards of bids happen, whereas there have been certain policy changes happen. For example, safeguard duties, which will have some impact on the projects. And in fact, Power Minister also last week mentioned that there is a certain degree of state reluctance to buy power from them. So I think some degree of counterparty risk and how much state can observe through an integrated policy need to be looked at. Besides some degree of renegotiation of PPA, which is not desirable happening in the wind sector. On the airport side, just a quick one. I think clearly airport, there is bundle of projects which we can see going ahead also. And we do see, some of the projects which have gone ground have done well. However, there also one of the key drag is that O&M will not attract PPP, whereas we need to have more robust PPP model in the airport to further improve the score. Before I conclude, just on the distribution side, I think the critical point is we had this Uday scheme 3 years ago. Everybody is closely watching how actually on ground targets will be met. The concern here is if you see the number reported by MOP most recently, the targets are still off the mark, and we really need to see what is plan B. And therefore, I think there is a clear case for PPP where we have seen successfully the turnaround has happened, and I think we need to have that in place. Just to summarize and conclude, I think high points on the power side, especially on the stress convention, which I not mentioned, we need to have slightly more improved competitive landscape, both for thermal as well as transmission. I think there is some degree of PPA which is being signed with NTPC as well as coal is given, whereas the thermal sector still are not able to get that. So I think some degree of landscape improvement can happen, which can help the sector. Integrating renewable with PPP distribution will become critical for taking more RE going forward. On the port side, I think we are looking at implementation of amendment of new major port authority bill, which will again help. On the railway, I think the critical is that we need, till the point independent regulator is in place, we need to see how we minimize cross-subsidization and how we bring back the passengers, especially looking at the air prices are going up. Can we bring back and do this revenue neutral thing there in the railway? Urban, I think, said it all many times. We need to see how municipal reform can happen, including the municipal bonds, if you can issue, how we can make it a revenue enhancement and self-sustainable in the urban side. Thank you very much.
I'll just now call over our guest of honor, Shri Amitabh Kant, to deliver his perspectives. I'm sure we're all looking forward to it, and I think he's known to be a very dynamic speaker, so we're all waiting to hear from him.
Ashu, Samir, Mr. Damodaran in the audience, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I think today's interaction is critical to my mind because India needs to grow rapidly at 8 to 9% year after year for 3 decades or more to be able to lift a very young population above the poverty line. And it's not possible to grow at high rates over a long period of time without good quality infrastructure. And good quality infrastructure with good operation and maintenance cannot be created by the government in the long run. It needs the private sector to play a very critical and a very major role in this. And it needs private sectors, I think one simply because there has to be, one has to realize that government's resource base is very finite and it has multiple claims. Government needs to put its resources into areas of education, health, nutrition, where a lot of work needs to be done. Secondly, there are greater efficiency gains and productivity gains by ushering the benefits of bringing in private sector. And I think thirdly, there has to be separation of regulatory and management arm distance roles of the government. So, but if you look at the last 4-year story in India, the government has actually put in a huge amount of resource into infrastructure. If you look at particularly the NHAI and if you look at the Pradhan Mantri Gramin Sadak Yojana, if you look at the housing program of the government has actually put in a huge amount of resources. It's almost more than made up for the absence of the private sector in infrastructure. And it has done this, but my belief is that the more government spends in infrastructure over a long period of time, it will end up creating very inefficient infrastructure because government is not the right agency, one, to operate and maintain infrastructure over a long period of time. It's not the right strategy. Now, I will briefly touch upon BOT, annuity and TOT projects. But my belief is that there's been a lack of private sector play, PPP play in infrastructure in the last 4 to 5 years. One, simply because to attract private sector in infrastructure, government needs to do a lot of good work. Government needs to create very sophisticated projects. You need to do a lot of homework. And my belief is that projects should never be bid out till you've not created a special purpose vehicle and you've not housed all approvals, including land, in that SPV. You should have the land, you should have the environmental approval, you should have every damn single approval, and you require about close to 30 to 40 approvals. All of these approvals must be housed in that SPV, and that individual SPV should be bid out. Without doing that homework, and I'll tell you, in India it requires about close to 2.5 to 3 years of homework to develop that level of sophistication and project. And this requires unleashing a number of government officials in the field to build large projects. Just do this homework. You know, I was in charge of DMIC. Each one of these projects has taken me 3.5, 4 years. We are doing a 150 square kilometer development near Aurangabad, Dholera. We've just, Prime Minister just launched this convention and exhibition center, which is almost twice the size of Connaught Place. It has required almost 3.5, 4 years of hard work, taking the land, all approvals, doing the trunk infrastructure. We've done all the trunk infrastructure, drainage, sewage, solid waste, which is the non-viable part of it. And now bidding out the private sector component of it on the back of that. And therefore, it requires that amount of hard work. And without that hard work, risks, you know, private sector plays what? It's about sharing risks. Otherwise, you are not de-risking projects. You're putting too many risks on the part of the private sector. And the more risks you put, the more arbitration you will end up having. And therefore, you end up having a lot of arbitration. And all these PPP projects have ended up in huge conflicts, dispute resolution mechanism is a problem, arbitration, and government ends up paying much more. So, you know, what we've done is we've done an analysis of BOT projects. And let me tell you, BOT projects have been very disadvantageous to India. Simply because all of them have ended up in major arbitration to the benefit of the private sector, simply because adequate homework was not done by the government. So project proponents have not done that adequate homework. So you need to do that. Having said that government was unprepared for several of these projects. Let me also say that in the private sector in India, there are too many coy boys. And the private sector has too much of aggressive bidding and, you know, underpricing of projects for PP. I mean, look at major highway projects bid out and bid by leading players. And let me name them. GMR, GVK, bid projects at prices which are non-doable and then backed out from them. And private sector must be blamed for them, for aggressive bidding. And they do bidding without due diligence in India. And therefore, you know, there's been a major problem because you have had private sector players who don't do their homework. And therefore, you need very matured private sector players. And thirdly, I think, in Indian case, there's been a very, very high dependency on commercial banks for PPP financing. And you can't there's been a huge asset liability mismatch. You need long-term lending of about 20 years. You can't do this through bank, which have, and there's been a huge asset liability mismatch. And there's been a completely over-leveraged balance sheet of developers. And, you know, the developers have just not been able to bring in adequate amount of equity. There's been a lack of equity. And that has, in many cases, there's been inflation of the total project cost by bidders. All these are day-to-day stories of each one of the projects that you analyze and examine. And therefore, you know, one is that till you don't do adequate homework, it's not possible. Government should never bid out BOT projects. And BOT projects require a lot of homework by the government, and government actually, to my mind, needs to put out close to about 100 odd officials just to structure projects in the field. Instead of putting government officials in the field pushing files, you need to put out officials to be very clear that we want to do these large projects on PPP basis, BOT projects, get them to get all the approvals in place, house them, and then bid out the SPV. So you need very efficient project preparation of activities. You need to ensure that there's land acquisition is fully done. You need to get all the approvals and clearances, and you need to then monitor all those activities. So one is this bit. The second bit is, to my mind, that the government having, in the last 4 years, the government has created a lot of projects. I mean, you look at airports, you look at highways, the government has actually done a lot. But government is extremely poor in operation and maintenance, and there's no reason. I mean, all this CAD issue which is being talked about, to my mind, more than FII, what the country needs is FDI, and which is long-term investments into the country. So there is no rationale for government for Airport Authority of India to manage airports. Government needs to ensure that all these airports are put out for private sector bidding so that it can attract the best players from across the world into airports. I think we need to put out all our airports for good private sector operations. And not just management, but for also commercial operation, for land development, for full airport development, as we've done in the case of Mumbai and Delhi. And we need to put out a lot of more airports. We need to put out many more roads under TOT, and TOT packages have been very, very successfully handled. So all the projects which have been de-risked, which have been completed, where tolls have started flowing in. Don't expect, I mean, if we expect pension funds to come in and invest in greenfield projects, we are sadly mistaken. No pension fund is going to risk putting money into greenfield projects in India, which are risky. They will come in when the projects are brownfield, when projects are completely de-risked, where tolls have already started flowing in, where revenue streams are fully assured. And therefore, India needs to put out all these brownfield projects where revenue streams are flowing in, out into the market and attract FDI from across the world, and you will get everybody to come in. And India is a very attractive market. Demand is already there, but India is an attractive market only for brownfield projects which are fully where revenue streams are flowing in already. So we need to put these projects out already. We need to put them all out into the market. There's no rationale for Airport Authority of an NHAI to manage these projects, to my mind. I think the other point I want to make is that there is a very major challenge. Increasingly, there will be a challenge of long-term financing in India, and we need to ensure that there are two issues I want to point out. One is about long-term financing. We don't have development finance institutions. All these development finance institutions have been converted into banks. So country needs to really think. To my mind, there is a need for a development finance institution. We also, if there is IIFCL, we need to strengthen that and ensure that long-term lending for infrastructure projects over 25, 30 years is adequately available. That is one issue. Second is India needs to develop its bond market, and that is critical. This is critical. Without a bond market, it will be very difficult to finance projects, infrastructure projects, over a long period of time. The third issue, to my mind, is the issue of dispute resolution. And dispute resolution gets into very protracted delays in India. You need very quick, fast dispute resolution mechanism where we are able to take a decision within 30 days and finish off with this one way or the other. And without this, one is fully developed projects. How to do more sophisticated project development is critical. Second is about ensuring that projects which have been constructed by government are sold out. There was talk about power sector here, transmission sector. Yes, it is an attractive sector, but on the power sector, my view is that much like steel in India, how demand was created, actually steel was would have become a sixth sector, but government acted very fast. Many of us in government acted very fast and ensured the steel was adequately protected, and why there is good bidding today, you see, for steel, SR steel plant, with ArcelorMittal, with New Metal all bidding for it, is because there is a demand for steel. Now power, you have this demand-supply imbalance. We'll have to create demand for power projects. I mean, there have to be a demand for projects, and demand for power will happen. I think we'll have to push for demand for power. One is what government is trying to do is to provide connectivity to households, etc. But more than that, there are you look at the power sector, quick demand will happen if government takes very strong decision on a lot of power projects which over the years have been running on dirty fuel, on furnace oil, on coke, petro coke, etc. And you know, if 14 of your 15 cities are amongst the worst cities, we need to clean up our cities. And this is one way to clean up our city. And if you don't do it today, tomorrow the courts will step in any case. So we need to clean that up. Secondly, projects which are more than 30 years and have been fully depreciated and are polluting your cities, you need to really come hammer and tongs on them. So very strong administrative action is also required. And once you do that, you would have created a huge demand for power in this country, which will ensure you that the existing plants will happen. But transmission is a great sector which can happen. Renewable is a great sector, and to my mind, many other sectors with adequate amount of homework will ensure, and wherever projects are fully developed, government will be extremely poor in doing operation and maintenance. They need to be bid out. So these are exciting days, and I'm quite sure that the last 4 years of investment that have been made in government will be put out into the market for many more private sectors to come in and do reverse. Reverse BOT has to be the key motto of the government in infrastructure. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, sir, for that insightful and encouraging session. I now welcome Pranav, who is our Director Energy, to present the vote of thanks.
Good morning to everyone. So far we've had some very good insights that have already been brought out. We've taken it upon us that, we will ensure that some of these views are taken up with the relevant stakeholders in the infrastructure domain so that we can take them to their logical conclusion. Some of the points that have really resonated very well with us, one clearly is in terms of having a favorable policy framework, a framework that is long-term, consistent, transparent, and also dynamic in line with change in market conditions. The other point that came across very well was in terms of having strong structures when you look at financing. There have to be projects that are bankable. A good support mechanism needs to be put into place to ensure that adequate funding at reasonable and attractive rates is made available. Also, the point that was made is to also have ready shovel projects for the private sector with equitable risk sharing mechanisms was another critical piece. So I think overall we've had some very good insights that have come up so far. On behalf of Crisil, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to our guests today, especially the Honorable Minister, Shri Suresh Prabhuji, Shri Amitabh Kant ji, thank you for gracing the second edition of the Infrastructure Conclave with your presence, and we also really appreciate you launching the Infrastructure Yearbook. So it's been a great experience so far, and at this stage I would like to call upon Ashu to felicitate Shri Amitabh Kant ji. Thank you once again. Over to you, Rital.
Thank you, respected guests, for gracing this occasion. And also, dear audience, thank you for being a great patient listener. We now come to a close of the inaugural session, and we look forward to the upcoming theme session. We will now pause for a short tea break, post which we will conduct the theme session, which is titled Vectoring Private Capital, which will be in the afternoon. After lunch, we will also be having 3 concurrent breakout sessions, as Samir has earlier mentioned. We would just like to bring your attention to our social media handles So kindly join us on social media using hashtag InfraConclave 2018. And also we formed a new group on LinkedIn, Crisil Infra Intelligence. Kindly do follow us. We look forward to connecting back here in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had an extremely power-packed session in the morning, and now we move towards our second session, which is the theme session. But before we get into the next session, I would quickly brief you on our query and feedback mechanism. We'd like to hear your voice loud and clear, so all of you can ask a question. Share your feedback live and real time. To do this, please log on to glsr.it/c4 using the internet browser on your smartphones, tablets, laptops, etc. I repeat, the address is glsr.it/c4. You could click go and you will be able to type in your questions while also voting for any question that interests you. The more popular questions with more votes will stand a higher chance to be answered by our speakers and panelists. So do make good use of this opportunity to get your voice heard. I would now like to invite Mr. Sudeep Sural, who is the session chair of the theme session, to come up on stage and conduct the proceedings. Sudeep is Senior Director, Infrastructure and Public Finance at Crisil Infrastructure Advisory.
Hi everyone, I extend a very warm welcome to the theme session, and I'd like to invite on stage our keynote speaker for this session, Mr. Junaid Ahmed, the World Bank Country Director for India. I'd also like to request Samir to join us on stage. Junaid is the country director for World Bank in India. He was previously the Chief of Staff, Office of the President, and he's been with the World Bank since the past 27 years and has held various leadership positions across urban water and sanitation in Southeast Asian region and also for the African region. He was also the Director for Sustainable Development in the Middle East and in the African region. He's worked in areas of urban finance, city management, service delivery in federal systems and local government reform. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Junaid. Let me just set the context for the theme session. I think the topic that we have chosen for the theme session, vectoring private capital into infrastructure, is something that has been bothering the stakeholders in infrastructure for quite some time now. And if we just look back a little bit in terms of the infra spending that has happened year on year, it's been a staggering pace. On an annual basis, it's actually jumped from about 7 lakh crores per annum to nearly about 9.5 lakh crores per annum, almost touching 10 lakh crores per annum. I think that's a very good double-digit year-on-year growth in infra spending. And as a percentage of GDP also, it's sort of improved, not at the level we would like it to be, but it's at about 5.7% of the GDP, being spent together by the center, the states, as well as the private sector. Some of the large areas of spend have been power, roads, telecom, railways, irrigation, and urban. If you look at it 4 years back, and I think this is really the theme today in this conclave, the share of the private sector in this mix was nearly about 1/3, and that's come down. If you see this graph here, it's come down to almost 1/4. It's touching 1/4 now. As a percentage of the GDP also, it's fallen from 2.2% to now 1.5%. And that's really a cause of concern. Some of the reasons for this are something that were discussed in the first half today in terms of the inadequacies in the PPP framework, the contractual agreements, over-reliance on bank funding, a sharp increase in non-performing assets of the banks and infrastructure sector has been a key contributor to that. And in general, a dampening of the sentiment by the private sector. Now, if you were to just look at the two largest sectors in infrastructure, which is power and roads, they constitute nearly about 50%. I think what comes out very starkly is that the share of the private sector has fallen in both these important sectors. So in power, for example, it used to be about nearly 43% and now it's down to 31%. In terms of the magnitude of the spend in rupees crore terms, also it has fallen in power. In roads, while it is somewhat gone up, but as a percentage of the share of private investment in roads also, the share of private investments has fallen from about 18% to 14%. But I think, you know, the more area of concern that, at least to me, what comes out is that there are certain sectors where private investment is virtually absent. For example, you know, urban, railways, irrigation, virtually very little of private investment. And some of the schemes launched by the government in terms of station redevelopment in railways or in the smart city mission has not really excited the private sector that much as we would have wanted. At the same time, what's happening also is that there is one cylinder which is really firing, which is the state expenditure on infrastructure. And if you see this slide here, in terms of the expenditure, it has grown by double digits every year. In fact, if you take a block of 5 years, it's grown by nearly about 75%. The current block of 5 years versus the previous block of 5 years. And, you know, the spend here, the state government spend here is much, much more compared to the spend of the center as well as the private sector. But the challenge here is that most of the spend, or I would say a predominantly large part of the spend, is through budgetary allocations of the state government, and the private sector participation again has been very, very minuscule. Now, if you look at what has happened during this period, while this is certainly something to be cheerful about, but what has happened during this period is that the fiscal parameters of the state budgets have actually deteriorated a lot. And if you look at this slide shows you that for the past 3 years now in a row, the fiscal deficit as a percentage of the GDP for the states has crossed the 3% mark, which is the prescribed limit by the Finance Commission. In fact, the debt to the GDP also is now inching close to 25% of the GDP, which again is the prescribed Finance Commission limit. Even as we speak now, the 15th Finance Commission is doing its work, so we'll see if there are new limits here for the state governments. And a key contributor obviously has been not only the spend, which I talked about in the last slide, but also the fact that we have now, you know, gone from a revenue sort of a neutral state in FY16 to a revenue deficit of 0.4%, which is again a cause for concern. So therefore, the implication of all this is that taken together, the state government and the central government spend on infra, having grown from 3.7% to 4.2%, is something, again, to be cheerful about, but the implication is that if this kind of a pattern of expenditure, namely the central and state expenditure vis-a-vis the private expenditure, were to continue, it'll have an impact on fiscal deficit, and the ramifications of that are going to be far, far more, and it'll impact the economy in a far greater manner. And therefore, the need for reversing this trend in private capital falling down in infrastructure. Now, last year, in the same event, we had forecast a 50 lakh crore requirement of infrastructure from 2018 to 2022. We've got some numbers on the slide here in terms of the yearly investments. And if I were to just take off the central and the state budgetary support for infrastructure from this amount, I am left with the last row here, which sums up to about 23 lakh crores, which basically is the source of fund that will come from other than the central and the state budgets. So this is the amount of money that we actually need in the next 5 years. And as we all know, historically, the bulk of the lending has been done by the banking system. Given the fact that we have a stressed asset situation there, obviously we will need other sources of funding, some of which were spoken of today in the morning. Foreign direct investment, funds raised through asset monetization, and more importantly, funds from multilateral agencies. And here is where India will look to the World Bank to help catalyze private sector investments while drawing in long-term capital market investors into infrastructure. India happens to be the largest IBRD client of the World Bank Group, and between 2015 to 2018, the World Bank has lent more than $10 billion to India, and as of mid-September 2018, the World Bank assistance has stood at more than $27 billion across more than 100 projects. So this is really the context in which we will have this theme session, and we will obviously deliberate on some of the key enablers that are required to get private investment up in terms of equitable risk allocation in PPP frameworks, some of the regulatory issues that we need to grapple with, innovative financing certainly, and also enforceability and flexibility of contracts. We will begin with the keynote address by Mr. Junaid Ahmed. This will be followed by the panel discussion, and we'll have a Q&A session post the panel. So I would now request Junaid to deliver the keynote address.
So good morning, or almost good afternoon. It's always interesting that we've been discussing this issue. How do you get private finance into infrastructure in India? I used to work in India between 2000 and 2004. We asked that question. Now I'm back here in India. We're still asking that question. So clearly, either we're missing the boat somewhere, or there's a magic bullet we're looking for and it doesn't come. What I want to do is just share a few thoughts to hopefully provoke a conversation. Let me begin with a few examples. One is one that I think will raise some eyebrows and curiosity. Over the last 10 years, 45 million women have been organized into self-help groups, and they have leveraged $30 billion from commercial and microfinance. Right? And the World Bank has spent $2 billion in this organization of these women. Now, this is fascinating. I mean, these are women that are borrowing money to send their children to school. So one is that they recognize the importance of human capital. Two, they're willing to borrow to do it. And three, clearly they have a revenue source that's enabling them to pay. So this, to me, is a fascinating story. And is a story that always puzzles me, is why are we not seeing a similar story of such of really big shifts in the infrastructure sector? Let me here give a few examples now from the infrastructure sector to try and answer that question. First is, take a look at Concor. Concor was created as a corporatized entity, public sector corporatized entity, many, many years ago. Right? It raises its money from the capital markets, if I'm not wrong, and it's delivering what it's delivering. Right? That's an Indian corporatized company. And it's reached into capital markets. Right? I'll give you another example. If you look at Indian Railways, it's gone through 3 distinct phases of transformation. The early phase, under colonial British control, Indian Railways was a group of private companies. A group of private companies which raised its capital in English markets. But it raised its capital in English markets because colonial government gave it a guaranteed return on the backs of Indian quote-unquote taxpayers. Then, over time, these companies were put under a One India Railway Company, but that railway company continued to run or operate with these private operators. Right? What happened then? You had the economies of scales achieved because there's one company, but the delivery was done by these private companies. And the contracting actually put quite a bit of accountability on these operating companies to achieve efficiency, including giving shares to its workers. That was the second phase of Indian Railways. Then the third phase of Indian Railways was complete nationalization. What is interesting is the most effective and efficient delivery of Indian Railways happened in that middle period, when it was owned by government, but actually contracted out and run by private companies with contractual relations that changed the nature and incentive of delivery. And those companies were able to bring in private capital to run. Again, this is an example from India itself. Then if you look at further in India, you will find that India has had electricity distribution companies in the public-private arena for quite some time, whether it's Kolkata or whether it's recently in the recent history of Delhi creating its two companies. And there too, you have seen shifts in both delivery and arrival of private capital. Today, there are 2 opportunities that I want to give as examples, and then move to what the principles that I think I'm suggesting to you. The 2 potentials are the following. You have the arrival, finally, of GST, major achievement, yes, challenges in implementation, but certainly moving forward. It's creating a unified market in India. That unified market is leading the way for what can be a big boom internally, which is the logistics sector. The logistics sector is already getting a boost from the freight corridors that have been established. Today, there is a separate freight corridor corporation that's building the rail lines. It's using state-of-the-art technology, multilateral funding, and the tracks are being placed on the ground. It will have an open access, meaning the corporation will allow private operators to come in. Once that happens, with this kind of a revenue base, this corporation can go to the market and really fund itself. One example. Another example, Mumbai. For several years, multilateral funding has been used by MRVC to create commuter lines in Mumbai. Major metropolitan areas, urban metropolitan areas, require commuter railway to bring workers into where jobs are. Right? This connectivity is extremely important. So the multilaterals, the World Bank, has been investing in creating commuter lines. We've now been asked to put in another $300 million into creating another commuter line. This time, we're asking the simple question. Instead of us investing in an infrastructure company that's actually a construction company, what if state of Maharashtra and the city of Mumbai created a commuter railway company, and we put a risk wrap around it so it can go into the markets and fund whatever lines it wants. So you go from a bankable project to a bankable institution, which is this commuter railway company. Similarly, in terms of the freight corridors, you go from creating a freight line to creating a company that can manage freight going forward. The punchline in all these examples that I'm giving is, if you get the institutional setup right of infrastructure service delivery, access to markets should not be a problem. Right? India's challenge is to move towards creation of bankable institutions, bankable infrastructure institutions. One of the world's largest water utilities is Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is a public corporatized institution that raises most of its money in US capital markets. Right? It's a public institution. Once the connection with the capital markets were created in a way that that corporate entity had to achieve its own accountability, it began to choose public-private partnerships to actually create delivery efficiency. So the path to getting infrastructure and investments in infrastructure need not be privatization, need not be public-private partnership. It really requires the state to begin to really think of recrafting its institutions of infrastructure service delivery. Today, there is not a single water agency in India that delivers 24/7 water. And that's not because Indian engineers don't know how to do it. It's not because there's not enough water coming to these utilities. Sometimes these utilities, whether it's Delhi or whether it's Mumbai or whether it's Hyderabad, per capita water in each of these cities is double or triple the amount of water that goes per capita to cities like London or Paris, or to some of the African cities that are delivering 24/7 water. It's about bankable institutions. I think there's a real need for India to question and ask, what are the type of institutions that it can create, and so that they can move into the capital markets. Right? And the examples that I'm giving, both from within India and already examples that are in the process of happening, tell you that the possibility is here today. There's no magic to it. Madhya Pradesh did an incredible bidding for generation of solar power. The bidding was such that it completely brought down the price of solar energy. Actually begins to show how each element of the bidding document that addressed the issues of risk brought down the price. And all the World Bank did was invest a little bit of public capital on the transmission. Right? And the other was, there was a buyer on the other side, which is Delhi Metro, a solid buyer. Right? That connection is what drove the prices down and brought in private capital. Again, no magic to the process. So I think that a lot of times we focus on financial engineering as a way to bring in private investment into infrastructure. I think the story really is about the shifts in the institutions of service delivery in order to trigger the type of changes in the financial markets. Now, I'm not arguing that the financial markets are efficient and at their optimal. I think you mentioned the NPLs. Clearly, India needs to look at its banking sector and the way the banking sector is moving. The fact that government has put in a solvency framework, the fact that RBI is putting out data on the NPLs, the fact that there are issues of merger of banks, all of these are the right steps, but you have to ask the question, can an economy of the size of India, requiring the type of resources it needs, does 70% of banking sector belonging to the public sector, is that the right balance? So there's an important structural question that has to be asked. But this banking sector then needs to enable a deeper debt market, deeper equity market that can feed into infrastructure financing. But that will not happen if the institutions of service delivery are not bankable institutions. Right? And I'm very careful in saying this is not about private bankable institutions. What I'm saying is you can use public corporate agencies to go into the market, but you have to be extremely serious about creating the arm's length relationship between the service provider and government to be able to get into the capital markets. That's a very, very important. The World Bank recently went to the board with our country partnership framework, which is setting the goal for the next 5 years of what we will do in India. And we've indeed committed to somewhere around $25 to $30 billion of investment into India. But what's important for us is a recognition that that $25 to $30 billion, which makes us a lending bank, is not the way to go. What we need to do is to use that money to leverage. We need to move from the paradigm of lending to leveraging bank, so that that 25 to 30 billion could actually leverage the capital markets. Now, how does it leverage the capital markets? We are arguing there are two directions that we have to focus on. One direction is investing in state capability, right? If the state's capabilities is weak, it cannot set the fundamentals for private capital to come in. And in this particular case, the country partnership framework basically says the future of India lies in the states of India. So we no longer should be thinking of project by project in the states of India, but begin to start thinking of how our money can support the basic state capability. So the states can begin to actually engage the private flows. I think the data that Crisil has shared shows that state investment in infrastructure has grown the fastest. Yes, that's related to state budget deficits, but that's where state capability comes in. State capability is about managing fiscal systems. State capability is about building the institutions that they can go to the market. So the one platform is investment in state capability from our side. The other platform is really trying to look at mechanisms of risk wraps. That if institutions are being built, what can be the risk insurance that we can put on the table that would give comfort to capital markets to come? So the real issue of infrastructure for us is through state capability, support the evolution of infrastructure service delivery systems that can go to the capital market, where we don't give lines of credit, but really start giving risk wraps. That's the direction that we want to go. I'm convinced that the logistics sector and the creation of the one market internally, if correctly leveraged, will give India a buffer in uncertain world markets of growth, which is, I think, going to be quite unique. You know, I jokingly say we're all worried about the One Belt, One Road of China. India has its own One Belt, One Road. It's internal to India. It's going to connect 29 countries of India, right? This is a storyline which requires the connection between capital markets, logistics sector, which is a bankable sector, and delivery on the ground. And I think it's a huge area. Let me conclude by congratulating Crisil for the work that it has been doing now for several years of lifting the agenda and debate around infrastructure. You are one group that has consistently made this message that India has much to gain in terms of the way it delivers infrastructure. And you've been persistent in the way you have delivered your advisory services, but you've also, in terms of the way you've put out the infrastructure yearbook, and I think it has contributed significantly to the debate and discussions that's ongoing. So from my point of view, if the name of the game is state capability to bankable institutions, the type of role all of us play, Crisil plays its role in that. So thank you very much for this event, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, sir, for those insights and for highlighting the possibilities of incentivizing the private sector in India. I now request Samir to felicitate Mr. Ahmed with a token of appreciation. So we now move ahead to the panel discussion, which is titled Vectoring Private Capital. I would just like to call your attention again on the Glisser web portal, where you can actually lodge your feedback and your questions. The address is glsr.it/c4. We encourage your use of this tool to help us gather your feedback. So we now commence the theme session. This session will focus on interventions needed to improve private participation in infrastructure. Sudeep will be our moderator for the panel discussion. Joining Sudeep will be a group of eminent panelists. I welcome each of you on stage. Our first panelist is Mr. Sujoy Bose, who is the CEO of NIIF, the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund. Prior to NIIF, Sujoy spent 25 years at IFC, most recently Global Co-Head and Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources financial institutions such as Leeton International, Lazard, HSBC and ICICI Bank. A very warm welcome, sir. Our next panelist is Mr. Ram Mahidhara, who is the Chief Investment Officer, Infrastructure and Natural Resources, IFC, Washington. During his career at IFC, Ram has worked on sectors such as transportation, logistics, power, telecom and mining in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. A very warm welcome to you, sir. And our last panelist for this session is Mr. Richard Lambert, who is our Senior Director, Analytical Manager, APAC Infrastructure Ratings from S&P Global Ratings. Richard heads the APAC Infra team with analysts based in Beijing, Hong Kong, Melbourne, Singapore and Sydney. He is responsible for the ratings of energy, utilities and transportation in the APAC region. As our panelists settle in, I hand over the reins to Sudeep. I would once again just like to bring your attention to Glisser. Kindly use this tool to ask your questions to our esteemed panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ridal. I extend a very warm welcome to all our panelists today. Thank you very much for joining us in this conclave. I think we have the privilege of hearing various views amongst all kinds of stakeholders now in the infra sector today. So we've got the Sovereign Wealth Fund, we've got the views from a private developer as well, and a large fund, Macquarie, private equity, IFC debt coming in, and of course, global rating agency, S&P. So we saw some of the deliberations since the morning, and I think one of the key things that nobody now needs to be convinced of, at least, is the need to get private sector investment up in infrastructure. And if I were just to talk about one big issue that has come up since the deliberations. I think it's the whole issue about the PPP framework, getting the right PPP framework. Mr. Amitabh Kant also talked about it. And if you look at the events of the past few years, I think what has come out very well in infra is that a lot of things go wrong right from the day one. Maybe it's because of inadequate project preparation done by both the government and the private sector. It's about, sometimes getting into enforceability of contract issues. Land acquisition has been a key challenge. And generally speaking, I think it wouldn't be incorrect of me to say that mostly if Murphy's Law seems to be at work, that if things can go wrong, most likely they will. So in that context, and given the fact that, typically contract enforceability, issues of land acquisition lead to areas where there is very little of consensus between the private concessionaire and the government. And that lack of consensus leads to costs, which in turn lead to arbitration and then liquidity issues, as you have seen from the events of the past few weeks. It still goes on. So let me begin with Sujoy. Sometime back, Sujoy, the government was thinking of, in fact, actually it was launched, in one of the budget speeches of the FM in terms of, the 3P India Institute. And the whole idea was to get the learnings of the past few years, incorporated and, a framework including capacity building from the government side, and various kinds of things which are required from an institutional PPP framework point of view. But unfortunately, nothing has really come out in terms of the 3P Institute. Would you agree that having that kind of an institute is really something that may perhaps help iron out some of these issues that I just described?
Thanks, Sudeep, and thanks for inviting me here. It's a great forum, and I think for us to be able to get together and discuss some of the issues around an asset class that is relatively different from many other asset classes which investors are much more familiar with, I think is very useful. And of course, this is the kind of forum and these discussions that hopefully will lead to continued evolution of the sector and of the sector as an asset class. Now, clearly, if I go through sort of the evolution of private financing of infrastructure in India, it's not something new. So it started almost, I would say, 30 years ago. And at that time, institutions were created. So one institution at that time that was created, which actually IFC had backed, was IDFC. And there were other institutions, including the institution we talk about today a lot, IL&FS, ICICI, even L&T was a part of the dialogue at that time, when a lot of the frameworks that basically kick-started private financing and infrastructure was developed with the help of all these institutions. And many of the, in NIF, some of those institutions, and by the way, Crisil has also been we have benefited from Crisil's thinking on the subject because we actually have a couple of colleagues in NIF who started their careers in Crisil Advisory. But the point is that those frameworks were developed, and I would say the first decade of infrastructure financing in India were relatively, I would say, cautious, but actually kicked off the concept of private financing and infrastructure. That followed with the hubris of the pre-GFC underwriting of risks that I think not just happened in India, but happened in other parts of the world. But I think in the infrastructure sector in India, it was taken to extremes. So for those of us who started our careers in project financing and infrastructure and then went on to invest equity in the sector, Financing, I mean, basically investing in roads where land has not been acquired, and then getting it financed through very high leverage. Financing power plants which did not have PPAs, acquiring a coal a fuel supply through non-transparent auctions. All this stuff were the first things that we would look at when we would look at the stability of an infrastructure project. And what transpired was something that actually, I mean, if you really on hindsight, it seems like it would have been quite expected by anyone who looked at the kind of underwriting and investing that took place at that time. I kind of second what Amitabh Kant said, that yes, of course, part of the issue is with project preparation, with contract enforcement, etc. But a major part of the issue is with underwriting and the risks that people took, in many cases often with very little equity, and in many cases in a conflicted manner because there were EPC contractors who were more interested in building an asset rather than operating an asset over the long term. So your question about are all these lessons being learned and is the framework evolving, I would say whether we are learning those through institutions or through specific government agencies, departments, I think the answer is yes. I think a lot of the problems we are seeing today are actually problems that are born out of that hubris of investing in infrastructure. And I think the MP solar bid that Junaid mentioned, if you look at TOT, I think the big thing in the government, which I'm very happy about, is the government has understood that it's not, it's not the same thing for every investor in the sector. The government has realized that infrastructure is an asset class where risk allocation is the key factor, and in many cases, construction, for example, is best suited to EPC contractors, whereas long-term operations, maintenance, toll collection, and financing is best suited to, say, fund managers, pension funds, sovereign funds, etc. And hence, I thought that the other very strong example of a good auction was TOT in the highway sector. And Suresh is over here, you saw the response where large institutional investors saw a well-structured auction, and a good auction results in good prices, and hence something that the government in this case built actually fetched them substantially more than they built because they were able to transfer those assets to a group of investors who understood the risks that they were taking and were much happier underwriting those risks. So basically your question, have we learned? Are we evolving? I think the answer is yes. Of course, we have still further to go.
Right. So basically what you're saying is that the government is cognizant of the need to have various kinds of frameworks, and a one-size-fits-all is not what the government believes in. But we are still not having an institutionalized mechanism to deal with, in terms of the 3P India Institute, which I
mean, if I may, so I think there are, so institutions like, or government agencies like Niti Aayog, etc., are working on the more general thought process, but some of these aspects are actually, and actually the 3P Institute concept still remains, so there is interest to continue to create that. But I think a lot of these things are actually dealt at the investment level by line ministries who need to understand how to take each, because each sector is also different, so you can't, you can't put one broad stroke. You heard from Amitabh Kant about AI and, the aspects with the airport sector. We've seen what's happening in Ministry of Road Transport and Highways. So I think it's that there also, it's not one broad brush, but different things.
Suresh, let me bring you in here. What is your view about, some of these issues? Specifically talking about the road sector, we've seen that, during demonetization, the developers lost a great deal. They were just perhaps only reimbursed, some interest on senior debt and maybe a little bit of O&M. But in terms of contract enforceability also, we've seen that many a times what happens is state government, stops the local users from, there's an issue of local users paying toll on national highways, and, the private developer suffers a lot. So how do you think, we should deal with this situation? What are the ways out in terms of, giving that sort of predictability to the private concessionaire, which he so badly wants?
Can I take a couple of minutes to just give a counter view to general theme, and then respond to your question specifically? We in the infrastructure, and I've been doing this for more than a decade now, right? And primarily, doing a lot of investing. And I have perhaps the unique distinction of investing when we thought that as infrastructure we walked on water and everything was gold. I also had the distinction of investing during the times when everybody thought that India is doom and gloom, 2013. And then continuing forward, we continue to invest in this. My approach, and perhaps my institution where I work for, Macquarie, approach has been slightly different. And maybe I'll take the opportunity to share my thoughts with that prism. One, India moves in incrementalism. It's not a country and a culture which moves in drastic steps, step changes, etc. It just doesn't happen. We somehow tend to get compared with China, right? But it could be chalk and cheese. The two countries, the way they are governed, the way their economies are built, the way their political system is, where the people are, ethnically we are different, everything is different. So we have to realize when we start to self-flagellate to say, oh, this is not happening, and this has gone bad, and we have to realize that there is a certain DNA to the country, and that DNA then ultimately drives a certain outcome, and that's what we get. So we have to recognize that, number one. Number two, the problems that we talk about that have happened, if I may just share with you that there has been a case in which the government came out with renewable auctions, and the developers started building these farms, and they were supposed to get a certain preferred tariff, and after building the farm, you didn't get the preferred tariff. Sound familiar? It's not India. It's happened in another country in Asia. We have a toll road, and the toll road has tariffs that are set, and you toll it, and the government says, you know what, we are going to give exemption to certain category of vehicles on a certain date. It is not included in the concession agreement, but the government goes ahead and does it, still. Again, sounds familiar? Again, it's not India. It's happened in other parts of the world as well. I can go on and on, right? I think the fact is that, and I'm now talking only from the perspective of long-term infrastructure investor, which invests around the world in various countries, emerging markets as well as developed world, is that there should be a recognition of that we are investing in an emerging market. There are certain risks that come alongside that. You are investing into an asset class which is fundamentally very different than let's say consumer or pharma and stuff like that. There will always be reliance upon the counterparty, which is the government of any government. And the third thing is that you always rely upon strong contracts. Now, moving that, without belaboring too much on this, but just to say that I think where we were and where we are today, we are in a much better position. I am not as pessimist as general media makes it out to be. We need to be smart enough to see what our successes should be. We cannot solve all the problems at the same time. But the fact today, we have Sujoy sitting here with a fairly large pool of capital, not just given by the government of India. He's got real sophisticated investors who have come and put capital behind him, and he's looking out to raise more. And while we are competitors, I applaud when something like an NIFS comes into being, because it's credentializing a sector. If we need a few $1 trillion, we need 10 NIFs, 10 Macquaries, 10 CDPQs, 10 CPPIBs, and incidentally what? We do have these institutions in the country today. I can name at least 6 representing a few $1 billion, and they're just not sitting idle, they're investing. Right? So I think the perspective has changed. The way we have looked at this as a PPP, but PPP as more as a construction with a lot of risks being taken, I think that perspective is also changing. Right. Coming back to the question that you asked, I think yes, of course we know we all want the contracts to be, crystal clear, very enforceable, timely enforcement, etc. Yes, but you know what? I think just the way we would go and buy a car and we pay, maybe 1 crore for a German brand and maybe a lesser one for some other brand. Similarly, if you look at most of the infrastructure investors and the developers would prefer contracts with the federal government, and perhaps they would shy away from investing into municipalities, and we did talk about that Mr. Kant talked about it. And the fact is that, there's a certain risk premium that gets attached to municipalities because the way they're constructed, exactly, right? So NHI has not been going back on its contracts, by and large, right? Demon is a national issue, and it's, I think, beyond NHI as well. But yes, state contracts have been changed. So, right. Sorry to take a contrarian position, but I don't feel that pessimistic.
No, I think I take your point, and I'm going to ask Richard to weigh in on, the experiences in the other countries. He's seen similar situations. But before I do that, let me, go to Ram. India has seen a huge jump in ease of doing business rankings, right? What is the outside-in view in terms of how the foreign investors are looking at India? And we saw that you need huge amount of funds in the next 5 years outside of the budgetary allocation and the banking system. So from a FDI point of view, from a foreign investor point of view, good jump in ease of business rankings, but what is the foreign investor saying?
So I don't want to claim and give you an answer that I know what foreign investors say. I can give you anecdotal evidence based upon clients I've spoken to, but we've got Suresh sitting here, and we've got Shujoy, and we've got others, Richard, who probably have a view on it. They may be foreign, but they're based here. I think a couple of things that came through today. So first, let me come in, let me answer your question directly, and then I'd like to step back a little bit. I think India is still considered a difficult place to do business. And I will quote, which I've done this before, and I think people have gotten tired of it, but there's a client of mine who, when I was talking to him about investing in India, I said, it's a large market, why don't you consider it? And he responded by saying, the trouble with you Indians is that your English is too good. So I kind of blinked a little bit and I said, tell me a little bit more about this. And he said, our culture, we shake hands on a deal, we'll implement the details later, but we've agreed that we've got an outcome and we'll deliver on it. Whereas what we found out, and they did a joint venture in India, is that the local partner had tied them up in knots with the legal documentation. The English was too good, and these guys didn't catch it, and in the end, they had to go to court to get a settlement, to get their portion of the money. The court ruled in their favor after 3 years, but the local partner evidently said, I thumb my nose at you, I'll take it to the next level of court. So that's just an example where I think there is a perception of difficulty. And it's surprising, given when you contrast it to China, where China's been so successful in the last 3 decades of getting foreign direct investment in. Perhaps there's hesitation now as people see that foreign direct investment means some things. First you get a local partner, then perhaps technology is shared, and then there are local Chinese competitors who become very strong and very good. Right? So there is that. India is far away from having that. I think FDI would be excellent for India. I think we have to, the answers are in everything that people said today, right? Minister Prabhu talked about an end-to-end solution. We don't have end-to-end solutions by far and large. We had the answers in the first half of the morning. End-to-end solutions, it's not that I've got the policy right. It's not that I've got this institution here. If I'm a foreign investor, Can I put money in, and can I take money out when it's time for me to do? And can I run that business the way, within the rules? If we can deliver that end-to-end solutions, we'll be so far ahead, there's no stopping us. We're not there yet, and Minister Prabhu's recognized it. I think something that Amitabh Kant said about perhaps large projects not being adequately de-risked and being better prepared, there is so much wisdom in that. We've got, if there's one thing India does not lack, it's bright minds. We've got such incredible human capital. We've got people in the government who are very smart. I think what we can do is very clearly prepare those projects, because we have seen internationally that projects that are sufficiently de-risked, government extracts a large amount of premium. I mean, the TOT business that we talked about is an example. You got 1.5 times the government's expected asking price. You have people coming in and bidding for it. There must be a reason, right? There's a reason that, okay, the people who won, and I believe it was your group, saw value, saw how they could extract value from this, still deliver value to the government, still pay above what the asking price was, and do well. So I think that's an area. I realize we're running short of time. There's a third area I think we should touch upon, and this again was touched upon, I think, by Amitabh Kant, about bond markets, right? And Junaid talked about India is going to develop in the states. And I'm going to go a little further and say, states are great, but we've got to look at the cities. I believe that urban ULB and ULBs have the implementations of the Ahluwalia High-Powered Committee report been implemented? Do we really have financials that are set up there? Can you folks in the rating business push hard to get cities to a point where they can have their financials structured, where they can actually get a rating? Because the growth over the next 3 decades worldwide and in India is going to be in the cities, and that's where you're going to see a lot of the growth.
Right. So Richard, going back to what Suresh said about some of these experiences also happening in other emerging markets. You've got a lot of experience in looking at infrastructure across countries in Southeast Asia. What have they done to grapple with these situations? One of the things that we've been talking about here in the Indian market is about renegotiation of contracts. And that was something that was also talked about by the Kelkar committee, which was on the PPP framework in infrastructure. So can you talk about some of the experiences in other countries which have dealt with similar situations as India is passing through?
Sure. Thank you, Sudhi. First of all, I want to thank Ashu and my Crisil colleagues for having me today, and how proud I am to be part of the S&P global family of companies with you guys and putting on an event like this. As Sudhi mentioned, what I do is run for S&P, the infrastructure ratings practice for Asia Pacific, which includes all of the countries ex-Japan. And so I was moderating a panel 2 weeks ago in Singapore around Indonesia, and guess what? I had the same question. What's going on in Indonesia? How can we solve these problems? What countries are doing it better? What countries are not? So, what's going on in India in terms of trying to attract private capital or foreign capital, which is really all I deal with because we're only rating bonds that are issued offshore. You guys take care of the local stuff. The question becomes one of bankability that was brought up a couple of times this morning, right? What makes a project bankable? And I'm not a big fan of that term because it's really in the eyes of the bank or the investor, right? Bankability to me might be different than bankability to you. And the problem is that capital today has so many choices and has so many places to put its money and so many different risk-return profiles to look at that I think it's a difficult exercise. But I think the main area that investors look at is some form of regulatory government certainty. To the extent I put my money in, as Ram was saying, can I get my money out? Or is it going to get tied up along the way? So in terms of contract enforcement and renegotiation, consistency and transparency, as was mentioned by the minister, I think is very important. In countries where they have been successful, Australia, Canada, they have much more homogeneous contracts But of course, they're tiny countries where you can do that. You know, the strength of India might be the 29 states. The weakness of India might be the 29 states. The US has the same problem. There is no single governing body. The cities are crucially important, but there's nobody that's advocating for them at the same level necessarily on the federal. So unfortunately, Sudip, I wish I could say there's a magic bullet here that other countries are doing it in a way that you guys could adopt tomorrow and would change them. It's really not the case. It's an evolving structure. But what I would say is a relationship between the private sector and the public sector, and Suresh can talk to this, is proper risk allocation and understanding of what happens if there's a problem, who takes that risk, who's best placed to take that risk. If you're building a project and you run into an archaeological issue, is it really the private sector's problem to pay for that, or should the government pay for that? Right of way is another issue. If you don't have certainty of that going in, your pricing is going to be higher. You have to price in that uncertainty. And potentially investors will say, well, in other countries they do it, they know how to do this, so I'm going to go over there.
So banks in India say that, getting bank funding for the right infrastructure project will not be a issue, right? And we've seen this whole IBC process take its shape. Sujay, what would be the top 1 or 2 learnings from the IBC process for infrastructure so that, we don't repeat the same mistakes again?
So I think one of the big opportunities, so if you really look at it from the international investor standpoint, in terms of, and we've been talking to a lot of them as we build out NIF, in terms of what are they looking for, because there's a large amount of capital in the sovereign funds, in the pension funds, in the institutional investors, that's basically looking for yield, because obviously the yield in the OECD markets is pretty low. And a recent survey shows that 43% of those investors are saying they will increase their allocation to infrastructure over the next 12 months, and only about 8% say that they will reduce their allocation to infrastructure. Now, this was the highest positive asset class in terms of allocation for around $100 trillion of capital. Now, when that capital looks for infrastructure assets, they are mostly looking for operating assets. They are not looking to construct, because construction, and your competitors, Moody's, does an analysis of pre-construction and post-construction risk across OECD countries and emerging markets. And pre-construction, the risk in emerging markets is pretty high. Post-construction, they are almost the same. So both probability of default and loss given default are almost the same between OECD markets, and I'm talking about the debt side, in OECD markets and emerging markets. So obviously, these investors are sophisticated and they pick this up. And for that same level of risk, they're getting a higher level of return. So while what we are going through in the IBC process in India is a challenge for the country, a challenge from an investment standpoint, the positive thing that the 10 years that we went through with substantial, so almost in the last decade, almost $1 trillion was invested into infrastructure in India. About 300 billion of that, and these are Ministry of Finance numbers, 300 billion of that was invested by the private sector. A large part of the 300 billion is basically looking to change hands. Some of that is looking to change hands through the IBC process. So from the perspective of the international investor, the IBC process is clearly an opportunity to invest into operating assets. And by the way, some of these assets were built. So they were built reasonably well. They just end up with a tremendous amount of leverage on them, which makes them financially unviable. So the IBC process helps clean this up and bring these assets into the market. So clearly, a lot of what has been going on in the IBC process is good for these investors, because from a contingent liability standpoint, it gives an ability to close out many of these things that investors don't want to take on. Where I think the learning is that more predictability and in terms of how that process will be concluded is going to be more useful to bring in foreign capital into it. What I think will also happen in the IBC process is that there will be some, I would say there will be some Indian companies who will take the lead in bidding on those assets that come through that process, but they will be supported with capital that will come from outside. So I think, look, I don't think there's a magic wand to say that this is the best way to, because these are very complex. Having done restructurings in other parts of the world, we will go through a complex process because it's also something we are learning. But bottom line, I think the availability of operating assets, the ability to buy them at a decent fixed cost, particularly if the variable cost on those assets is attractive, and finally to acquire them with closing out contingent liabilities, I think is a very positive opportunity for those investors.
Right. So operating assets, obviously a lot of opportunities the IBC process is throwing up for foreign investors. Suresh, we've had in the past developmental financial institutions in this country to assess greenfield projects, right? Now, obviously, Macquarie and other similar investors or the long-term pension funds, etc., will not be interested in greenfield assets. And the DFIs have turned into banks. IFCL is more of a takeout financing institution. Do you think we are missing a greenfield developmental financial institution for project appraisal, given all what has happened in the banking system in terms of the stressed assets? Infra is a big contributor to that. So do you think it's now time for a greenfield financial institution, a financial institution for greenfield project appraisal, maybe in a new avatar, maybe not in the DFI avatar, maybe in a new avatar?
Both yes and no. Yes, why? Because we are indeed going through a period in which there is virtually negligible project finance available in the market. So even if there is a good project, it is just not available for anybody to go and raise debt. It's not so much about contracts and the bankability. I think it's just a fear of existing institutions, banks not being able to underwrite that risk, or they being basically they're shying away from that process. So yes, if you have to fix that problem, we have to perhaps launch an agency which will start providing this, which will build a center of excellence, and the skills that we have lost perhaps will come back. But again, if you look around the world, has the world built its infrastructure assets with such agencies only? Answer is no. Ultimately, the project financing is done by proper large commercial banks. They have specialist project finance divisions which have specialists. You have law firms which have project finance specialists, legal advisors, rating agencies, and everything that goes along with it. And what perhaps we would need to move to is finding that balance between risk allocation, what the banks will be able to take, and how much equity would need to step in. We have historically built projects with minuscule equity and large amount of domestic public sector debt. If you look at similar projects around the world, or even brownfield assets around the world, they have a fairly large degree of equity sitting behind it. From our institution's perspective, given that I have a visibility of Asia portfolio, the maximum leverage tends to be on assets in India, even on brownfield assets. If you look at Korea, Philippines, even China, the level of leverage is much lower. And I dare say that if we started to bring in real equity to back behind our projects, greenfield or brownfield, the banks would start to become more comfortable. I mean, we talked about TOT for a moment, and it got rated by Crisil. And right from the beginning, we were going ahead with close to 50-50 debt equity, which is unheard of. A natural inclination would be operating asset, 30-year cash flows, no major construction risk, etc. You lever it to the hill, right? But the fact is, where is that debt in India? It's not there, right? So to an extent, I think a few things need to fall in place. For a quick fix, yes, perhaps an institution, but ultimately we need to have this risk distributed across broader set of banks and get a better risk allocation done between equity and debt.
Sure.
Add to this, because
Thanks, because I think Suresh makes a very important point, which is about how to finance actually these. So it's not about having one institution of one kind or another institution of another kind. It's about really having some rules, traditions, customs about how, and practices about how to finance these assets. Now, also one of the reasons that infrastructure assets have been bid at a very aggressive way, in a very aggressive way, and they've been leveraged then to the hilt, is because a lot of the developers have been EPC contractors. And EPC contractors, their focus is to build the asset for the highest cost possible, because they are making a margin on that, right? So one of the things, so if we were to look at NIF and say, what is the one aspect, so there are many problems with the sector that need to be resolved, one of the things that we want to focus on is counterparties. Junaid mentioned this aspect of institutions, but as Suresh said, so there are the Macquaries, the Brookfields, etc., that are operating in this space, but we need more. And we need ones with indigenous capability. The great thing about them is that they are putting teams on the ground, and we need to have more teams that understand infrastructure investing, that have the capital, and have the discipline to bid on these things in a reasonable manner, have a structure, financial structure that is stable, and have the interest to operate these assets efficiently over a long period of time, and that's how they get their returns. So that's why I said that I'm actually quite pleased with the way TOT, etc., is being done, because it shows that the government has realized this and wants to separate asset building, sometimes maybe build the assets in the public sector and then pass them on to owners who have the lowest cost of financing and can operate them the right way.
Right. So Ram,
sorry, since it was becoming a bit heavy, let me just share an anecdote. Perhaps all of us should enjoy that, just on that point. So about 7-8 years ago, we were doing diligence on a very large infrastructure asset, and we saw a lot of debt covenants being breached, left, right, and center. And during due diligence, we picked up, and I mean, all foreign investors and large institutional investors take these covenants very seriously. If you're breaching it, you're reporting to your investor that our asset is likely to breach. Anyway, so I remember sitting through this diligence meeting, post-diligence meeting with the counterparty, and said, sorry, you are having trouble. You are breaching all these covenants. He says, no, we are not breaching any covenants. We are just not meeting them. So you can imagine that the companies and the banks were treating it so lightly.
Correct.
So in that regard, you can create any institution, right? It will never be done.
Right.
Anyway.
So let me, just bring this issue about creating strong counterparty institutions, which was brought out by Junaid also in his keynote address. You've done a lot of work, I think, in the urban sector, right? And we are looking for a huge amount of investments there. Unfortunately, nothing is really coming in by way of private investments. How do you tackle this issue? What are the global examples that you can share with us in terms of urban local bodies, getting them to be stronger counterparties and therefore attract the private sector? I think you also have a product on partial guarantee, right, to enable private sector funds to come in. So if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure, but I can't resist answering your last question, which is, do we need a new institution? I think India doesn't need a new institution personally. India's got so much brain capacity. We know what the problems are, we know what the solutions are, we've got to implement it. It was out there. The reason why some things become quite successful is because they've been, the main issues have been de-risked. And what you're putting out there is something that generates cash, that you think the private sector can run better and operate better and extract revenues better, and it is successful, right? So I would go back to what Mr. Amitabh Kant said about taking large projects, if you're going to do them, and spending the time to have those structured properly and removing it. Most of the reasons why we have a lot of stranded assets sitting there and is because we have delays, and the delays introduce cost overruns, which introduce further delays. And half of these delays could be land acquisition, half of them are because we don't have the fuel supply agreement, etc., etc. These things have to be worked out in the beginning, and then you're using the private sector for what you want, which is get them to run the thing efficiently and use their creativity to extract what they can out of it, and put their risk capital at work in those points. So that's it. As far as urban areas go, so let me come back to something that I did some back of the envelope numbers a couple of months ago when I met Samir at the other conference. So I looked at, these are revenues published by the government of India, the top 41 metro areas, excluding Delhi, Mumbai, and Kolkata, right? And the total revenues were about 2.5 billion. So I said, let's use an assumption, wild as it may be, that the revenues of the other 3 large metros combined are 3 times those of the remaining 40, so another 7.5 billion. So you get about $10 billion, right? That's the annual revenues. If you look at what the 2011, it's still a vintage report and it still makes sense, the Ahluwalia report, commission, about 30 billion on average annually required for capital and another 15 for maintenance. 45 billion versus 10. You've got a ratio of 1:4. There is no way you can have urban bodies pulling that sort of money in or states pumping in more and more money there. You've got to have a different system. And there are, again, we don't lack smart people. We don't lack people who know accounting and who know finances. So I really think this is where rating agencies can play an important role. We've got to have urban areas, select one, not everyone will be there. On average, I think you've got about 4 to 5% of urban areas rated. We've got to get them rated, and we've got to get them to be able to start borrowing monies, which ties in with the other instrument, the bond market.
Right.
And in order for them to float bonds, we've got to make sure we have a secondary bond market, because that is what is going to introduce transparency and introduce the sort of transparency and shine a light on the finances.
Right, right. So I think the urban bodies they've already started the process of getting themselves rated. About 100 of them have got themselves rated, and I think some of them I have been trying to access the bond market. So Richard, let me ask you about getting capital market investors and bond market investors enthused in infra. One of the things that the rating agencies have done in India is to introduce a new infrastructure rating scale called the expected loss rating scale, which is basically, a post-default rating, on a scale of 1 to 7. So we'll have the probability of default rating and expected loss rating. S&P, I believe, also has a similar product. So what's been the experience in other markets?
Well, we rate to probability of default primarily. So we will do a recovery analysis and then might adjust the rating based on what we think the ultimate recovery would be. And in infrastructure, we believe that it does perform differently than non-bank financial corporates, along the lines of that it does have a higher recovery value, and then potentially a higher rating on that basis. Sujay is exactly right. These things do perform better regardless of jurisdiction, and it's often because infrastructure are essential assets. They're put up by governments. They serve a very specific need in a city or a state, and that even if it goes through some kind of slowdown period, ultimately the value will return. If you're selling power, maybe demand goes down, but ultimately if a country is growing, that power demand will return. So it depends a little bit on who you are as an investor, right? If you're willing to wait until the very end, till the end of the life of the concession or the asset, our data shows you're likely to get back all of your money. If you have to sell, because you're having a problem and you're going to not wait till the end, you're going to sell on the secondary market, you're likely to take a loss because other people are going to come in and buy your pick in the asset, you put it into an SPV and separate it. You only have a recovery if there's been a default, right? There's no reason to recover something that's still performing. And there aren't a lot of defaults globally in project finance, right? These things are structured to withstand macroeconomic government issues, and so they will perform for a while. They have liquidity. And so the recovery data we have, especially in emerging markets, is a little bit limited. So I'm not sure there's a data set yet to draw large conclusions other than that they tend to perform pretty well.
Please.
there's something else. There's a theme that's been running. And it's been mentioned a couple of times. Do we get foreign investors in? How do we get them in? The same thing with the ratings. We've got a few ratings, urban labor bodies coming in, and we're doing the ratings. I think the one place where we're going to see a significant impact for India is if we stop being self-contained. When you bring foreign investors in, you also bring foreign technology, you also bring experience in different places. The same thing with ratings. We shouldn't be comfortable rating our urban areas just among ourselves, but look at how other urban areas have performed. I mean, if you look at the South African Roads Agency, one reason they did very well is very early in the game they realized that if they were going to be isolated, and if the banks were essentially playing them pretty well. So the head, this is 1996, the head was sent by the government and spent 2 months at Deutsche Bank, 2 months in New York training on bonds, understanding what the bond markets were about, and came back and realized they were being played quite well. That's when they introduced this whole notion of let's get a secondary bond market in. That introduces transparency and forces honesty. When they were having bidding, they got foreign investors, they got neutral third parties. I know that this sounds very self-serving, but it was the EIB or the IFC or the Asian Development Bank. These are agencies that can come in and help set some of the benchmark. India doesn't need this, but what I'm saying is foreign investors, whether they are DFIs, whether they are private investors, will introduce an air of transparency and will bring some amount of best practice, which I think is important.
Is required, yeah, correct, right. So we'll just stop here now and throw the floor open for Q&A from the audience. So if there are any questions from the audience, and if you could identify yourself and also the person to whom you want to direct the question. So in the meantime, there are some questions on Glisser, which is the online app for asking these questions. One of the questions is, do you think private sector can bring better and faster infrastructure solutions? And I think you were alluding to that a little bit, but just to get your view, Sujay, in terms of better and faster. And India is always looking for better and faster.
Look, infrastructure development in development per se, in India, in a country like India, which is democracy, where land is scarce, land is very prized, there are, and when I say democracy, you have to get all the right approvals in place, you have to make sure that there's consensus. So I come from the IFC mindset where you have to go through a consultation process with people who are affected by these large projects. It's not easy. There is no simple solution, whether it be public sector, private sector, hybrid, whatever, right? What is important, I think, is to build these projects in a way that they are stable. Of course, I mean, to speed them up as much as possible, but to build them such that they achieve the motivation that they were started with. I mean, today, if you look at the airport sector, the aviation sector, the growth in the aviation sector in India is, for a size of the aviation sector that we have, is unprecedented. I think it's very difficult for any country. The only country I've seen where things can be done that rapidly is China, and it's because it has a unique system of development and decision making. Not too many other countries, whether India or OECD countries, any of them have that. So I don't think it's just that bringing in private sector will make it faster or quicker. It's really, my focus is really on building it right and building it for the long term and making sure that once it's built, it does not go through a lot of the problems that the infrastructure sector has gone through in the past. And I think government has a role to play. Anything that is done in infrastructure has a government connect. So because these are, like Richard was saying, these are in many cases monopoly assets. So you can't also just open it up to the private sector. But maintaining that balance between speed and longevity and stability is, I think, the more important thing in the development of infrastructure.
Yeah, and just I would add, I think the answer is the private sector or foreign capital coming in. No, they can't make it faster. They want it faster. They can't make it faster. However, if the government, land acquisition, right, they can't speed up the right-of-way acquisition. That's a government issue. However, if the government doesn't speed it up, then they're not going to come back. So maybe their demand for it will drive it.
Yeah, I think from my side, the unequivocal answer would be only the government can move fast. Private sector cannot move fast. Private sector can move efficiently, but the government can move fast. And I'm just reminded by, Mr. Damodaran is sitting amongst us, and he's a director on your board, and he's advisor to us also, and somebody whom I really admire. And if you look at the example that he had, he fixed UTI. That was a government decision. He was a bureaucrat, and they fixed it, and they fixed it well. The contagion was blocked, right, with the right messages being given, etc., etc. Imagine private sector. Private sector would have just crumbled. It would have been a train wreck, right? Maybe the learning the government has now is being implemented to island affairs. So only the governments can move fast.
Right. So does anyone in the audience have any questions for the panel? Right. So I think we'll just take one more question and then we'll just wrap it up. This question is from Glisser. Is there a scope for deeper G2G relationships enabling partnerships? So would you want to just talk about that, what your experience has been?
So I'll put my biases on the table. I really think that G2G is fine, but I really think the private sector is where the action is. Government needs to set the enabling environment, and this end-to-end business that we are talking about, I mean, I cannot underscore it enough. The private sector can't deal with the land acquisition. So when you've got a project, a highway, a portion of a highway or something like that, or an airport, you've got to have that all those areas fixed, and then let the private sector come in. You need money, you need rapidly changing adjustment to technology. In the airport sector, every 5 to 7 years, there is enough of a change that you have to have somebody who is nimble enough to go with that. So my view is, I really think you need to have private sector play a role. I'm not a huge fan of the government. You've seen what China has done in Africa, and I don't think most of those projects have been what I would call economical.
So I think we'll bring the panel discussion to an end with that, and what is clearly coming out is the fact that it's not a doomsday scenario. Some of the issues that India has been facing, many of the other countries have faced similar situations. And certainly, we can't have a one-size-fits-all solution. There have been various talks about various kinds of formats of PPP frameworks. And I think the way to go is also to strengthen some of our counterparties, which will actually help get some of the private capital that is so much required. So with that, I bring this panel discussion to an end, and I thank all my esteemed panelists for having come here today, enlightened us with your views. Thank you very much.
Sharing your wonderful views, I now request Sudeep to felicitate each of our esteemed panelists. Important announcements. Post-lunch, there will be 3 breakout sessions, which the venues for which are like this. This particular room, which is a grand ballroom, will be divided into 2, and this portion is grand ballroom 1. So the title the session titled Power Distribution, Recharging the Distribution Paradigm will be happening here. There is just one request on this one. The Power Secretary, who is the guest of honor for this session, Mr. A.K. Bhalla, is arriving here at 1:30. So this session would be starting at about 1:45. We kindly request you to please be punctual and come back here. So the people attending the power session will be having a shorter lunch break. The other session will be happening on the other side of the ballroom. This will be titled Transport, Shifting the Gears. This session will start at 2:15 p.m. And the third session, which is titled Urban Water Supply, Getting the Flow Right, will also be held at 2:15 p.m. But this would be on the 10th floor in Le Cirque. So we hope that you participate in all of these sessions with an equal gusto. We request that you please carry back all your belongings because this entire room is going to be rearranged and we may not be able to keep your belongings. Lunch has been arranged in the pre-function area in 2 zones. One is right up front across the hall and one is onto your left. So let's now break for lunch and we will see you back shortly. Thank you very much.